This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information, or to find out how you can volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. Some Experiences of an Irish R.M. by Edith Inoni Somerville and Martin Ross. Chapter 10. The House of Fahy. Nothing could shake the conviction of Maria that she was by nature and by practice a house dog. Every one of Shrelane's many doors had at one time or another slammed upon her expulsion, and each one of them had seen her stealthy, irrepressible return to the sphere that she felt herself so eminently qualified to grace. For her, the bone thriftily interred by Tim Connor's terrier was a mere diversion. Even the fruitage of the ash-pit had little charm for an accomplished habitué of the kitchen. She knew to a nicety which of the doors could be burst open by assault, at which it would be necessary to whine sycophantically, and the clinical thermometer alone could furnish a parallel for her perception of mood in those in authority. In the case of Mrs. Cadogan, she knew that there were seasons when instant and complete self-effacement was the only course to pursue. Therefore, when on a certain morning in July, on my way through the downstairs regions to my office, I saw her approach the kitchen door with her usual circumspection, and on hearing her name enunciated indignantly by my cook withdraw swiftly to a city of refuge at the back of the hayrick, I drew my own conclusions. Had she remained as I did, she would have heard the disclosure of a crime that lay more heavily on her digestion than her conscience. "I can't put a thing out of my hand but he's watching me to whip it away," declaimed Mrs. Cadogan, with all the disregard of her kind for the accident of sex in the brute creation. "'Twas only last night I was back in the scullery when I heard Bridget let out a screech, and there was me brave dog up on the table eating the roast beef that was after coming out from the dinner." "Brute!" interjected Philippa, with what I well knew to be simulated wrath. "And I had planned that bit of beef for the luncheon," continued Mrs. Cadogan, in impassioned lamentation, "the way we wouldn't have to intrude on the cold turkey. Sure he has it that dragged, that all we can do with it now is to run it through the mincing machine for the Major's sandwiches." At this appetizing suggestion I thought fit to intervene in the deliberations. "One thing," I said to Philippa afterwards, as I wrapped up a bottle of Yanatas in a cardigan jacket and rammed it into an already apoplectic Gladstone bag, "that I do draw the line at is taking that dog with us. The whole business is black enough as it is." "Dear," said my wife, looking at me with almost clairvoyant abstraction, "I could manage a second evening dress if you didn't mind putting my tea jacket in your portmanteau." Little, thank heaven, as I know about yachting, I knew enough to make pertinent remarks on the incongruity of an ancient 60-ton hireling and a fleet of smart evening dresses. But none the less I left a pair of indispensable boots behind, and the tea jacket went into my portmanteau. It is doing no more than the barest justice to the officers of the Royal Navy to say that, so far as I know them, they cherish no mistaken enthusiasm for a home on the rolling deep when a home anywhere else presents itself. Bernard Shute had unfortunately proved an exception to this rule. During the winter the invitation to go for a cruise in the yacht that was in process of building for him hung over me like a cloud. A timely strike in the builder's yard brought a respite, and in fact placed the completion of the yacht at so safe a distance that I was betrayed into specious regrets, echoed with atrocious sincerity by Philippa, into a life pastorally compounded of petty sessions and lawn tennis parties. Retribution fell when it was least expected. Bernard Shute hired a yacht in Queenstown, and one short week afterwards the worst had happened, and we were packing our things for a cruise in her. The only alleviation being the knowledge that, whether by sea or land, I was bound to return to my work in 4 days. We left Shrelane at 12 o'clock, a specially depressing hour for a start, when breakfast has died in you and lunch is still remote. My last act before mounting the dog cart was to put her collar and chain on Maria and immure her in the potato house, whence, as we drove down the avenue, her wails rent the heart of Philippa and rejoiced mine. It was a very hot day, with a cloudless sky. The dust lay thick on the white road, and on us also, as during 2 baking hours we drove up and down the long hills, and remembered things that had been left behind, and grew hungry enough to eat sandwiches that tasted suspiciously of roast beef. The yacht was moored in Countess Harbour. We drove through the village street, a narrow and unlovely thoroughfare, studded with public houses, swarming with children and poultry, down through an ever-growing smell of fish to the quay. Thence we first viewed our fate, a dingy-looking schooner, and the hope I had secretly been nourishing that there was not wind enough for her to start was dispelled by the sight of her topsail going up. More than ever at that radiant moment, as the reflection of the white sail quivered on the tranquil blue, and the still water flattered all it reproduced, like a fashionable photographer, did I agree with George Herbert's advice: praise the sea, but stay on shore. "We must hail her, I suppose," I said drearily. I assailed the Eileen Ogue, such being her inappropriate name, with desolate cries, but achieved no immediate result beyond the assembling of some village children round us and our luggage. "Mr. Shute and the 2 ladies was after screeching here for the vote a while ago," volunteered a horrid little girl, whom I had already twice frustrated in the attempt to seat an infant relative on our bundle of rugs. "Timsy Hallahane says 'twould be as good for them to stay ashore, for there isn't as much wind outside as out a candle." With this encouraging statement, the little girl devoted herself to the alternate consumption of gooseberries and cockles. All things come to those who wait, and to us arrived at length the gig of the Eileen Ogue, and such by this time were the temperatures and the smells of the quay that I actually welcomed the moment that found us leaving it for the yacht. "Now, Sinclair, aren't you glad you came?" remarked Philippa, as the clear green water deepened under us, and a light briny air came coolly round us with the motion of the boat. As she spoke, there was an outburst of screams from the children on the quay, followed by a heavy splash. "Oh, stop!" cried Philippa in an agony. "One of them's fallen in. I can see its poor little brown head." "'Tis a dog, ma'am," said briefly the man who was rowing stroke. "One might have wished it had been that little girl," said I, as I steered to the best of my ability for the yacht. We had traversed another 20 yards or so, when Philippa, in a voice in which horror and triumph were strangely blended, exclaimed: "She's following us!" "Who? The little girl?" I asked callously. "No," returned Philippa. "Worse." I looked round, not without a prevision of what I was about to see, and behold the faithful Maria swimming steadily after us, with her brown muzzle thrust out in front of her, ripping through the reflections like a plough. "Go home!" I roared, standing up and gesticulating in fury that I well knew to be impotent. "Go home, you brute!" Maria redoubled her efforts, and Philippa murmured uncontrollably: "Well, she is a dear." Had I had a sword in my hand, I should undoubtedly have slain Philippa; but before I could express my sentiments in any way, a violent shock flung me endways on top of the man who was pulling stroke. Thanks to Maria, we had reached our destination all unawares. The 2 men, respectfully awaiting my instructions, had rowed on with disciplined steadiness, and as a result we had rammed the Eileen Ogue amidships, with a vigour that brought Mr. Shute tumbling up the companion to see what had happened. "Oh, it's you, is it?" he said, with his mouth full. "Come in. Don't knock. Delighted to see you, Mrs. Yates. Don't apologise. There's nothing like a hired ship, after all. It's quite jolly to see the splinters fly. Shows you're getting your money's worth. Hullo! Who's this?" This was Maria, feigning exhaustion and noisily treading water at the boat's side. "What? Poor old Maria? Wanted to send her ashore, did he? Heartless ruffian!" Thus was Maria installed on board the Eileen Ogue, and the element of fatality had already begun to work. There was just enough wind to take us out of Countess Harbour, and with the last of the outrunning tide we crept away to the west. The party on board consisted of our host's sister, Miss Cecilia Shute, Miss Sally Knox, and ourselves. We sat about in